All right, let's talk about Jon III. Jon III is, in many ways, I think it's based on some Hollywood stereotypes and stereotype kind of stories. It seems to be very much in line with An Officer and a Gentleman, which, if you haven't seen this movie, it's Richard Gere, and he's trying to become a Navy pilot, and he is being trained by Lou Gossett Jr. And Lou Gossett Jr.'s character is very hard on him, but he's like the tough on him guy, and makes Richard Gere grow as a human being, and Richard Gere discovers who he is as a person and everything. And there's the other plot is the allure and temptation of a woman, like making you forget your duty and things like this, and creating this balance. And when you think about Jon's story, is a lot of that, where he joins a military organization, not really knowing what it is, has to learn and discover who he is on the inside. There's a temptation of a woman and all sorts of things. And Jon III is the classic, like, boot camp, story, where the Lou Gossett Jr. Kind of character being played by two different roles here: the Alistair Thorne and Donal Noye, and Jon discovering the type of person that he wants to be. I think a lot of people, keep in mind, Officer and a Gentleman was a very influential movie, and in a way, a lot of people have seen Full Metal Jacket, which is largely stealing from An Officer and a Gentleman. I mean, it literally steals lines. But most people remember that, like, the character from Officer and Gentleman in that boot camp situation more. It's certainly more intense, and it's hard not to see, in the show, they even took a character like Sir Alistair and softened him a little, so that you sort of like him in the same way that you would like Lou Gossett Jr.'s character. And some people even like the character from Full Metal Jacket. I mean, Full Metal Jacket character kind of dies before he can be redeemed in any way. But you kind of, there's this sympathy for the tough bully teacher who's just trying to get these guys to grow up. But this chapter turns some of that on its head. I mean, Sir Alistair is kind of a piece of shit through and through, but we'll see. Let's get into this. But keep in mind, this is, you got to remember, like, George R.R. Martin's, what movies he's watching when he's coming of age, and what influences him. And so, Officer and a Gentleman comes out in 1982, and Full Metal Jacket in 87. And so you have to remember that these are very big, influential movies on people at the time. Anyway, let's get into it. So, Jon, the courtyard rang to the Song of Swords. George loves using song. Under black wool, boiled leather, and mail, sweat trickled icily down Jon's chest as he pressed the attack. Gren stumbled backwards, defending himself clumsily. When he raised his sword, Jon went underneath with a sweeping blow, and then that crunched against the back of the other boy's leg and sent him staggering. Gren's downcut was answered by an overhand that dented his helm. When he tried a side swing, Jon swept aside his blade and slammed a mail forearm into his chest. Gren lost his footing and sat down hard on the snow. Jon knocked his sword from his fingers with a slash of his wrist and brought a cry of pain. "Enough!" Sir Alistair Thorne said. Sir Alistair Thorne had a voice like the edge of like an edge. I'm sorry, tongue-tied. "Enough!" Sir Alistair Thorne had a voice with an edge like Valyrian steel. Of course, this is coming very soon after the Catelyn chapter, so we're supposed to, of course, be thinking that of cuts of Valyrian steel at the same time, like, Cat cutting her hands and Alistair's voice at the same time. Gren cradled his hand. "The bastard broke my wrist." There was a really crappy thing that Jon does, because Gren lost his footing and sat down in the snow. It almost seemed like the battle was over, and Jon just comes over and whacks his wrist and breaks it. The bastard hamstrung you, opened your empty skull, and cut off your hand, or would have, if these blades had an edge. It's fortunate for you that the watch needs stable boys as well as rangers. Sir Alistair gestured at Jaren and Toad. Get Aurochs to his feet. He has funeral arrangements to make. Now, of course, again, everybody's nicknamed, just like in these boot camp stories, Private Pile and whoever. Everybody gets their nicknames, their derogatory nicknames to toughen them up. Jon took off his helm as the other boys were pulling Gren to his feet. The frosty morning air felt good in his face. He leaned on his sword, drew a deep breath, and allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. That is a longsword, not an old man's cane, Sir Alistair said sharply. Are your legs hurting, Lord Snow? Jon hated that name, a mockery that Sir Alistair had hung on him the first day he came to practice. The boys had picked it up, and now he heard it everywhere. He slid the longsword back into its scabbard. No, he replied. Thorns strode towards him, crisp black leathers whispering faintly as he moved. He was a compact man of 50 years, spare and hard, with gray in his black hair and eyes like chips of onyx. The truth now, he commanded. I'm tired, Jon admitted. His arm burned from the weight of the longsword, and he was starting to feel bruises now that the fight was done. What you are is weak. I won. No, the Aurochs lost. One of the other boys sniggered. And of course, to defend Sir Alistair here, and Sir Alistair is a horrible guy, he's kind of right. Like Jon is a trained fighter with years and years of experience, and he's just beating up people that have no military experience, like no training. These are regular people, and he just broke somebody's wrist. Jon is being an absolute jerk here, an absolute horrible person. And of course, we meet Donal Noye, who tells, explains the morality of everything, and is really the savior of the chapter. One of the other boys sniggered. Jon knew better than to reply. He had beaten everyone that Sir Alistair had sent against him, yet it gained him nothing. The Master-at-Arms served only derision. Thorne hated him, Jon had decided. Of course, he hated the other boys even worse. That will be all, Thorne told him. I can only stomach so much ineptitude in any one day. If the others ever came for us, I pray they have archers, because you lot are fit for nothing more than arrow fodder. Now again, we're supposed to think that he's toughening them up, and this is good for them. And but George R.R. Martin doesn't really believe that. All of us do kind of have this idea that with enough training and toughening up, you can get through stuff. And it's later on there's this statement that no, Sam's never going to get better. Which I don't know how many people really believe that. The hopelessness of Sam is almost cartoonish. There is some truth to the idea that toughening somebody up for battle will make them stronger, and then they can deal with stuff. I mean, you can take things to extremes, and Alistair Thorne is supposed to be taking things to extremes. He's not doing it. He's not actually doing it because he wants to improve these boys and make their lives better and make them strong. He's doing it because he's a cruel asshole. And we're playing on the officer and the gentleman role. Lou Gossett Jr.'s character is trying to toughen them up because he actually cares about them and wants them to succeed. Sir Alistair does not care about this, but it's but at the same time, George R. Martin is almost questioning the whole process of toughening people up and whether that works. Jon followed the rest back to the armory, walking alone. He often walked alone here. There were almost 20 in the group he trained with, yet none of them he could call a friend. Most were 2 or 3 years his senior, yet not one was half the fighter Robb had been at 14. Darian was quick, but afraid of being hit. Pip used his sword like a dagger. Jaren was weak as a girl, Gren slow and clumsy. Halder's blows were brutally hard, but he ran right into your attacks. The more time he spent with them, the more Jon despised them. So Jon, he thinks he's better than them all. Which, in a sense, John's the idea here is that John's like highbornness, you know, has seeped into him. I mean, John's not highborn, but he was raised highborn, and it's kind of seeped into him. Inside, John hung. But I'll get more into this, like John's mentality and George R. R. Martin's mentality. George R. R. Martin grew up poor, but he believed that, or he was told that his family actually had like wealthy roots and had a proud history behind them, and so he also can. George was obviously much smarter than many of the people around him and more talented, and so I think in John, George R. R. Martin is kind of writing his own kind of feelings, where he's growing up with people who are like, dumber than him, and he's thinking arrogantly about them, but at the same time he's nobody because he's poor, and people might dislike him because they might come across that he thinks he's better than them or something. But I think some of this is probably coming out, George's experience with John being kind of caught between two worlds. John is very talented and has this belief that he's highborn when he's not, and he's around a bunch of people that have not been given the same opportunities and don't have the same innate talent, So inside, John hung sword and scabbard from a hook in the stone wall, ignoring the others around him. Methodically, he began to strip off his mail, leather, and sweat-soaked woolens. Chunks of coal burned in iron braziers at either end of the long room. But John found himself shivering. The chill was always with him here. In a few years, he would forget what it felt like to be warm. His weariness came on him suddenly as he donned the rough-spun black that were their everyday wear. He sat on a bench, his fingers fumbling with fastening on his cloak. So cold, he thought, remembering the warm halls of Winterfell, where the hot waters ran through the walls like blood through a man's body. There was scant warmth to be found in Castle Black. The walls were cold here, and the people colder. No one had told him the Night's Watch would be like this. No one except Tyrion Lannister. The dwarf had given him the truth on the road north, but then it had been too late. John wondered if father had known what the wall would be like. He must have, he thought. That only made it hurt worse. Yeah, it's interesting. The idea that Tyrion is at this point smarter than everybody, and he hasn't kind of made his own naive mistakes yet. I think Tyrion grows into a much more foolish, naive character than he's first presented. He's first presented as this know-it-all, right? That can get out of any situation. And we're almost supposed to believe like almost everything from his mouth is just correct in a Game of Thrones. It's not until a Clash of Kings where he's sort of tricked and manipulated by Varys and Shay, and he starts making a lot of just big mistakes, rather than just being the guy who's the smartest guy in the room, who's getting through everything. So we're supposed to think that like Tyrion Lannister's opinion about the Night's Watch is perhaps the correct one, even if he doesn't believe in others and such. But and so I understand in the show why they give Donal Noye's role to Tyrion, but it fits so much better with Donal Noye as his own character because of Donal Noye's background, fitting into George R. R. Martin's like worldview and things like that. Rather than, because Tyrion's also highborn, so he's kind of in the same situation as John, right? Like they believe they're highborn and better than everybody else, even though they're kind of derided for being a bastard and being a dwarf, right? And so they everybody sees them as inferior, but they think they're better than everybody else, and so they're alone. The later advice that Donal Noye gives comes best from Donal Noye. But yes, the fact that Ned has never provided John this information about what the Watch is really like is telling. I do wonder if he's thinking that about young men that join the military where their fathers know what the military is and they don't tell their sons, like, oh, it's a great, wonderful place to serve your country and be patriotic. And then they get in the military and it's something else, you're seeing horrors and war and being brutal and things like that. So I think there's a bit of that, but also like the system, Ned had to send Jon to the Wall because Jon was a bastard and there's no place for him, that kind of thing. Later retconned away, but yes, at the time, this is why Ned sent him to the Wall. Even his uncle had abandoned him in this cold place at the end of the world. Up here, the genial Benjen Stark he had known became a different person. He was First Ranger, and he spent his days and nights with Lord Commander Mormont and Maester Aemon and the other high officers, while Jon was given over to the less than tender charge of Sir Alliser Thorne. 3 days after their arrival, Jon had heard that Benjen Stark was to lead a half-dozen men on a ranging into the haunted forest. That night, he sought out his uncle in the great timbered common hall and pleaded to go with him. Benjen refused him curtly. This is not Winterfell, he told him as he cut his meat with a fork and dagger. On the wall, a man gets only what he earns. You're no ranger, Jon. Only a green boy with the smell of summer on you. Stupidly, Jon argued. I'll be 15 on my name day, he said, almost a man grown. Benjen Stark frowned. A boy you are, and a boy you'll remain until Sir Alliser says you're fit to be a man of the Night's Watch. If you thought your Stark blood would win you easy favors, you're wrong. We put aside your old family values when we swear our vows. Your father will always have a place in my heart, and these are my brothers now. But these are my brothers now. He gestured his dagger at the men around him, all the hard, cold men in black. So what Benjen is saying that, we're all brothers, but at the same time, there's an apparent bullshit to what Benjen is saying. Benjen is spending all of his time with the highborn officers, and we learn about these officers, right? Waymar Royce, who arrives on the Wall and immediately, even though he's inexperienced, is sent off leading a ranging. Right? He's hanging with Maester Aemon, highborn. Jeor Mormont, highborn. Alliser Thorne seems to have his position because he's highborn. Even though the Night's Watch is supposedly this big equalizing thing, it's not. It seems that the highborn people become officers immediately, and are pointed that by the Lord Commander. And when we get to the Lord Commander election, there seems to be a big thing about being highborn being this really important thing. So Benjen, I mean, he's kind of self-deluded, but this isn't Benjen's wrong. And he's kind of presenting it as Alliser Thorne is gonna make you fit and things like that. It's like Alliser Thorne is just being an asshole. There's nothing. He's really bad at his job, and he's only been given his job because he's highborn. Jon rose at dawn the next day to watch his uncle leave. One of his rangers, a big, ugly man, sang a bawdy song as he saddled his Garran, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. Ben Stark smiled at him, but he had no smile for his nephew. How often must I tell you no, Jon? We'll speak when I return. And it's good that Jon doesn't go, because Jon would have disappeared with Benjen and his 6 men. No one ever talks about the other 6 men. What about them? As he watched his uncle lead his horse into the tunnel, Jon had remembered the things that Tyrion Lannister told him on the King's Road. In his mind's eye, he saw Ben Stark lying dead, and his blood red on the snow. His blood red on the snow. The thought made him sick. What was he becoming? Oh, this is the idea that he's now imagining his family. His family killed because he's so angry at them, and that's what Tyrion did. Afterward, he sought out Ghost in the loneliness of his cell and buried his face in his thick white fur. If he must be alone, he would make solitude his armor. Castle Black had no godswood, only a small sept and a drunken septon. But Jon could not find it in him to pray to any gods, old or new. If they were real, he thought, they were as cruel and implacable as winter. This is what's funny is that Jon begins the story as an atheist. And later on, the primary reason that he doesn't leave the Night's Watch is because he would have to forsake the gods of his father, which is, a really funny switch. And I don't know if it's because, his mind is getting manipulated by ghosts at that period of time, or he's had some sort of spiritual awakening. We don't hear very much about any spiritual awakening, right? Besides like the one moment with Ghost getting touched by the werewood with Bran's face on it, but things change over time. All of a sudden he wants to be like his dad, even though like his dad didn't warn him about things, and Jon doesn't seem to be very religious. So, if they were really thought they were cruel as implacable as winter. He missed his true brothers, little Rickon, bright eyes shining as he begged for a sweet. Robb, his rival and best friend and constant companion. Bran, stubborn and curious, always wanting to follow and join in whatever Jon and Robb were doing. He missed the girls too, even Sansa, who never called him anything but my half-brother, since she was old enough to understand what bastard meant. And Arya, he missed her even more than Robb. Skinny little thing that she was, all scraped knees and dangled hair and torn clothes, so fierce and willful. Arya never seemed to fit, no more than he had, yet she could always make Jon smile. He would give her anything. He would give anything to be with her now, to muss up her hair once more and watch her make a face, to hear her finish a sentence with him. The finishing the sentence with him is, of course, like the needle scene, or maybe they do it all the time, but they both say needle at the same time. But, again, the weird creepiness that when George is writing this, he was imagining an eventual romance between Jon and Arya. But interestingly enough, he says that Jon and Robb were constant companions. But later, like, Theon is made into a friend of Robb. Of course, Theon is actually much old. Like, in terms of teenagers, like, he's much older. Like, I think, Robb's like 14 and Theon's like 18 or 19. And so, I think the Theon-Robb friendship was kind of built in later for the Theon story. It doesn't really make sense because Jon never talks about being friends with Theon. But if he and Robb were constant companions and Theon and Robb were constant companions, wouldn't Jon and Theon be constant companions? Like, but we don't get that. But it's just, it's just one of those things. You broke my wrist, bastard boy. Jon lifted his eyes at the sullen voice. Gren loomed over him, thick of neck and red of face, with 3 of his friends behind him. He knew Totter, a short, ugly boy with an unpleasant voice. The recruits all called him Toad. The other 2 were the ones Yoren had brought north with him, Jon remembered. Rapers, taken down in the fingers. He'd forgotten their names, and we never find out what they are. He hardly ever spoke to them, if he could. They were brutes and bullies, without a thimble of honor between them. Jon stood up. I'll break the other one of you if you ask nicely. Gren was 16 and was a head taller than Jon. All 4 of them were bigger than he was. But they did not scare him. He'd beaten every one of them in the yard. Maybe we'll break you, one of the rapers said. Try, Jon reached back for his sword. But one of them grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. You make us look bad, complained Toad. You looked bad before I ever met you, Jon told him. The boy who had his arm jerked upwards on him hard. Pain lanced through him, but Jon would not cry out. Toad stepped close. The little lordling has a mouth on him, he said. He had pig eyes, small and shiny. Is that your mommy's mouth, bastard? What was she, some whore? Tell us her name. Maybe I had her a time or two, he laughed. Jon twisted like an eel. and slammed a heel down across the instep of the boy holding him. There was a sudden cry of pain, and he was free. He flew at Toad, knocked him backwards over the bench, and landed on his chest with both hands at his throat, slamming his head against the packed earth. The two from the fingers pulled him off, throwing him roughly to the ground. Gren began to kick at him. Jon was rolling away from the blows when a booming voice cut through the gloom of the armory. "Stop this now!" Jon pulled himself to his feet, and Donal Noye stood glowering over him. "The yard is for fighting," the armorer said. "Keep your quarrels out of my armory, and I'll make them my quarrels. You won't like that." Toad sat on the floor, gingerly, feeling the back of his head. His fingers came away bloody. "He tried to kill me." "So true, I saw it," one of the rapers put in. "He broke my wrist," Gren said again, holding it out to Noyes for inspection. The armorer gave the offered wrist the briefest of glances. "A bruise, perhaps a strain. Maester Aemon will give you a salve. Go with him, Totter. That head's wants looking after. The rest of you return to your cells. Not you, Snow. You stay." All right. Donal Noye. So Donal Noye, he is presented as almost the purest of characters that Jon ever meets. I don't necessarily think that everything out of Donal Noye's mouth later on becomes true. I think it's true at the time that George R.R. Martin writes it. But I think Donal Noye is a lot of fans quite famously pull the Donal Noye quote about who Robert, Stannis, and Renly were. And I don't necessarily think, he says, Robert was the true steel. Stannis is iron, but brittle and will break. And Renly is copper, pretty, but nothing, no substance. And I think that line is at the beginning of a Clash of Kings. And a lot of fans go back to that line a lot. And you got to remember that at the time, that was George R.R. Martin's idea about who Stannis and Renly and even Robert were. Even at that point, though, Robert had already become a more complicated character. So not everything that Donal Noye says is perfect, but if there's going to be a character who's going to be saying what George R. R. Martin believes and who has the correct right opinion, it's Donal Noye. The Watch has need of every man it can get, Donal Noye said when they were alone. Even men like Toad. You won't win any honors killing him. Jon's anger flared. He said my mother's was a whore. I heard him. What of it? Lord Eddard Stark was not a man to sleep with whores, Jon said icily. His honor did not prevent him from fathering a bastard, did it? Jon was cold with rage. Can I go? You go when I tell you to go. Jon stared sullenly at the smoke rising from the brazier until Noye took him under the chin, thick fingers twisting around his head. Look at me when I'm talking to you, boy. Jon looked. The armorer had a chest like a keg of ale and a gut to match. His nose was flat and broad, and he always seemed in need of a shave. The left sleeve of his black wool tunic was fastened at the shoulder with a silver pin in the shape of a longsword. All right. Words won't make your mother a whore. She was what she was, and nothing Toad says can change that. We have men on the wall whose mothers were whores. And so this is the fun, just brilliant, some wisdom from Donal Noye. Maybe Jon's mother was a whore, maybe she wasn't. But what Toad says doesn't at all change that probability. Which is true. These words, and we get angry all the time at what people say. And what they say doesn't make it true. It may be true and it may not, but them saying it doesn't change it. It doesn't, the truth of the world doesn't actually change with with somebody actually speaking it. The world there's reality in the world, right? Donal Noye is, and you getting angry at it is, doesn't change anything either. There's no need in it. So, and then he's saying, he's also then saying, and even if she were, who cares? It doesn't matter, which is also true. Donal Noye's wisdom here is supposed to be taken to heart. on how you're supposed to get through life. Not my mother, Jon thought stubbornly. He knew nothing of his mother. Eddard Stark would not talk of her, yet he dreamed of her at times. So often he could almost see her face. In the dreams she was beautiful and highborn, and her eyes were kind. And this I always had the problem with Jon's mother actually being a highborn person, because it does kind of strip everything from Jon's story. Like Jon is supposed to be a good person on his own, and it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter if his mother was highborn. Like we're learning in the story that being highborn doesn't make you a good person, and the belief that like being highborn makes you better is like immediately it's specifically being shattered by the Sansa chapter, right? So who cares if his mother is highborn? So I almost kind of feel like Jon finding out who his mother is, ruins Jon's story, like, because it's about who Jon is, right? Like her being kind, and like look how highborn is slipped in there with beautiful and kind, like Jon is kind of broken in the sense that he's very broken in the sense that he's not highborn, but he believes himself. He believes all the system. He believes the system that highborn people are better as well. Like he's making the same mistakes that Sansa is making. You think you had it hard being a High Lord's bastard, the armorer went on. And this is also like this Donal Noye advice is very spot on. That boy Jaren is a Septon's get, and Connor Pike is the base-born son of a tavern wench. Now he commands Eastwatch by the Sea. And you want to like, that's pretty impressive. Like he's talking about like, why isn't Jon connecting with Jaren? Instead, he insulted Jaren by saying he was weak as a girl. And Cotter Pike, this is an ironborn guy, an ironborn bastard. Everybody would hate him. And he rose to commanding Eastwatch with a C. That's impressive of Cotter Pike, So it's, I always kind of had the problem with Tyrion and John having a whole chapter about how they're the same. Like, oh, he's a bastard and he's a dwarf, and like being a dwarf is like being a bastard. And it's like, no, being a dwarf's a lot worse. Like it's clearly worse. It's clearly worse historically. It's clearly worse in the world of Ice and Fire. Jon's bastardy isn't really, besides his own complexes, it's never something that really keeps him back. Like it's never something that keeps him back. Like no one ever says, oh, this opportunity. I mean, him joining the Night's Watch in the first place, I suppose, but then that's taken away with the retcon that he was probably going to be given a Lord's Keep. Like the only thing that's keeping him back is his own psychosis about it. And here, Donal Noye straight up tells us that that's the case. You're a High Lord's bastard, I don't care, Jon said. I don't care about them. I don't care about you or Thorne or Benjen Stark or any of it. I hate it here. It's cold. Yes, cold and hard and mean. That's the wall. And the men who walk it. Not like the stories your wet nurse told you. Well, piss on the stories and piss on your wet nurse. This is the way of it. And you're here for life. Same as the rest of us. This is also we're not talking about the wall. We're talking about the world here. Donal Noye is correct. The world sucks in a lot of different ways, but we're all in this world together. Life, Jon repeated bitterly. The armor could talk about life. He'd had one. He'd only taken the black after he lost an arm at the Siege of Storm's End. Before he'd smith, and this is the thing, is like he's getting angry at Noye because he feels like Noye has had a life. So he like lists this life, and then you're like, oh fuck, Donal Noye's been through some shit. He'd only taken the black after he lost an arm at the Siege of Storm's End. Before that, he'd smithed for Stannis Baratheon, the king's brother. He'd seen the Seven Kingdoms from one end to the other. He'd feasted and wenched and fought in 100 battles. They said it was Donal Noye who'd forged King Robert's warhammer, one that crushed the life from Rhaegar Targaryen on the trident. He'd done all the things that Jon would never do. And when he was old, well past 30, well past 30 is old. And then when he was old, well past 30, he'd taken a glancing blow from an axe, and the wound festered until the whole arm had come off. Only then, crippled, had Donal Noye come to the wall when his life was all but over. Past 30. But yeah, there's some questions on how exactly he lost his arm. I mean, you're in a siege. I guess there must have been a sortie every once in a while or something. But but they kind of talk about the Siege of Storm's End as like Stannis' starvation. But again, these things, these things kind of get changed. Like at the time, it's a Siege of Storm's End, and maybe you're not thinking the starvation aspect might have been like added later, and how they don't have any food and the need for Davos comes in. But yes, life, Noye said. A long life or a short one. It's up to you, Snow. The road you're walking, one of your brothers will slit your throat for you one night. They're not my brothers, Jon snapped. They hate me because I'm better than they are. No, they hate you because you act like you're better than they are. They look at you and they see a castle-bred bastard who thinks he's a lordling. The armorer leaned closely. You're no lordling. Remember that. You're a Snow, not Stark. You're a bastard and a bully. And really, it is really, really good advice from Noye, because I think a lot of people, they go through life feeling entitled, and they think they're the victim, and so they bully other people because they think they're the victim, and in fact they're the bully. I think perhaps we've all done this at different times in our lives, and maybe are ashamed and embarrassed at those times. But it's Donal Noye's assessment of Jon is pretty spot on. It's almost lost and forgotten at some point, but because they still try to push this whole like Jon being a bastard is a barrier thing, and it's not ever really a barrier for him. It's just his own personal psychosis. But it's of course, this is all like people often bring up like the Polonius life advice from Hamlet that he gives to his son Laertes. This is the famous like a borrower and a lender be and stuff like this, like as being really good life advice. Like Polonius is a nitwit character, but he gives this like speech of like really solid advice. The Donal Noye speech here is like really fucking solid advice, but it also gets to the heart, because later he's getting into the heart of things. A bully, Jon almost choked on his words. The accusation was so unjust it took his breath away. They were the ones who came after me, 4 of them, 4 that you humiliated in the yard, 4 who probably afraid of you. I've watched you fight. It's not training with you. Put a good edge on your sword and they'd be dead meat. You know it. I know it. They know it. You leave them nothing. You shame them. Does that make you proud? And so this is this thing of like, does making fun of other people like, make you stronger or something, kicking other people down. And this is how a lot of people do go through life. Jon hesitated. He did feel proud when he won. Why shouldn't he? The armorer was taking that away too, making it sound like he was as if he were doing something wrong. They're all older than me, he said defensively. Older and bigger and stronger. That's the truth. I'll wager your master at arms taught you how to fight bigger men at Winterfell, though. Who is he? Some old knight? Sir Roderick Cassel, Jon said warily. There was a trap here. He felt it closing around him. Donal Noye leaned forward into Jon's face. Now think on this, boy. None of these other men have ever had a castle at arms until Sir Alliser. Their fathers were farmers and wagon men and poachers, smiths and miners and oars on a trading galley. What they know of fighting, they learned between the decks and the alleys of Old Town and Lannisport and wayside brothels and taverns on the King's Road. They may have clacked a few sticks together before they came here, but I promise you, not 1 in 20 was ever rich enough to own a real sword. His look was grim. So, how do you like the taste of those victories now, Lord Snow? Don't call me that, Jon said sharply, but the force had gone out of his anger. Suddenly he felt ashamed and guilty. I didn't think. Best you start thinking, Noye warned him. That or sleep with a dagger in your hand. Now go. Now, the Donal Noye advice, which this is, I mean, in the end, this is a really brilliant chapter, just because Donal Noye does like recognize all of the faults in George R.R. Martin through Donal Noye has called out all of the faults of the Jon Snow story, and kind of lampshaded it. Like Jon Snow isn't really hindered. Okay. I do like that. But then he gives this really good life advice, really fucking good life advice. That, I mean, one of the best speeches that you'll ever see in Ice and Fire is here. But also he destroys the entire narrative of the chapter, which is the officer and the gentleman kind of idea that these experience of toughening people up and being mean to each other make them stronger. And what Noye is saying is no, like the answer is not toughening people up, it's empathy, right? The whole point is empathy. And the Donal Noye conversation, which eventually leads to Jon's empathy being recognized by Maester Aemon, which allows him to become, Lord Commander. And then that empathy, transitions to the wildlings. I mean, he wins the battle. I mean, there's the Battle of Castle Black, which, he works well with all of these people that weren't necessarily traditional fighters, like Satin. And then he becomes Lord Commander, and this empathy idea extends to the wildlings and all of this. So it's Jon's journey is the understanding of empathy. Of course, he had really good empathy before with Arya, but he's extending it to more people. But so it's also George R. Martin's idea about life. Life isn't about toughening people up. What we need is boys to be hard and have them go through military experience, and put them on the football field, and when they get hit, you go, suck it up, get up, walk it off. What George R. Martin is saying is that's not the way to go through life. That's not the lesson of life. The lesson of life is empathy, to think about your own privileges, understand other people's positions, and try to connect with them. And that's the way to make friendship and allies and everything. And the Noye speech transitions very well to Jon's brilliant speech with Maester Aemon and his feelings about Sam Tarly. By the time Jon left the armory, it was almost midday. The sun had broken through the clouds. He turned his back on it and lifted his eyes to the wall, blazing bright and crystalline in the sunlight. Even after these weeks, the sight of him still gave him the shivers. Centuries of wind-blown dirt had pocked and scoured it, covered it like a film, and it often seemed a pale gray, the color of an overcast sky. But when the sun caught it on a fair bright day, it shone alive with light, a colossal blue-white cliff that filled up half the sky. The largest structure ever built by the hands of man, Benjen Stark had told Jon on the King's Road when they first caught the sight of the wall in the distance, and beyond a doubt the most useless, Tyrion had added with a grin. But even the imp grew silent as they rode closer. You could see it from miles, a pale blue line across the northern horizon, stretching from the east to the west and vanishing in the far distance, immense and unbroken. This is the end of the world, it seemed to say. When they finally... This being... So there's this... The Bran believing that they're going through a curtain at the end of the world is interesting because Jon is seeing this as well. But of course, we're at two different ends of the world. Bran specifically, even further north, there's another curtain, another end of the world that they go through. But it's interesting that Jon is seeing this as a curtain at the end of the world. When they finally spied Castle Black, its timbered keeps and stone towers looking like nothing more than a handful of toy blocks scattered on the snow beneath the vast wall of ice, the ancient stronghold of the Black Brothers was no Winterfell, no true castle at all. Lacking walls, it could not be defended, not from the south or east or west. But it was only the north that concerned the Night's Watch, and it had the north, and to the north loomed the wall. Almost 700 feet high it stood, 3 times the height of the tallest tower in the stronghold it sheltered. His uncle said the top was wide enough for a dozen armored knights to ride abreast. The gaunt outlines of huge catapults and monstrous wood cranes stood sentry up there, like the skeletons of great birds, and among them walked men in black as small as ants. And John, George filling the chapter with his beautiful descriptions of things. As he stood, though the ants thing may come back all the way at A Dance with Dragons, like Dany sees the ants like climbing over the dirt, and it's kind of like the ants, is that the others climbing over the walls, or people climbing over walls, or what? As he stood outside the armory looking up, Jon felt almost as overwhelmed as he had that day on the King's Road when he'd seen it for the first time. The wall was like that. Sometimes you could almost forget that it was there, the way you forget about the sky or the earth underfoot. But there were other times when it seemed as if there was nothing else in the world, and it was older than the Seven Kingdoms, and when he stood beneath it, he looked up. It made Jon dizzy. He could feel the great weight of all the ice pressing down on him, as if it were about to topple. Somehow Jon knew that if it fell, the world fell with it. Somehow Jon knew that the wall needs to be defended against the others. Yeah. Makes you wonder what lies beyond it, a familiar voice said. Jon looked around. Lannister. I didn't see. I thought I was alone. Tyrion was bundled in furs so thickly he looked like a very small bear. There's much to be said for taking people as unaware. You never know what you might learn. So you won't learn anything from me, Jon. You won't learn anything from me, Jon told him. He'd seen the little of the dwarf since their journey ended. As the Queen's own brother, Tyrion Lannister had been an honored guest of the Night's Watch. The Lord Commander had given him rooms in the King's Tower, so-called, though no king had visited it for 100 years. Foreshadowing. And Lannister dined at Mormont's own table and spent his days riding the wall and his nights dicing and drinking with Sir Alliser and Bowen Marsh and the other high officers. So in the show they end up having Tyrion hanging out with Yoren the whole time. But here it's interesting that Tyrion's been hanging with Alliser Thorne. Now, of course, Alliser Thorne comes and visits Tyrion. Not visiting on a personal level, but he comes down later. And they seem to have an antagonistical relationship, but really they were like dicing. He was dicing and drinking with Sir Alliser every night for like many nights. Like, it's just kind of forgotten about. I'd like to now. I'm kind of want to. Do I want to go back and see what they actually now? I've totally forgot that like Tyrion spent all of this time with him. Let's see what they say here, because it's in Clash. See, this is the funny thing. Clash of Kings. It says, of all the Black brothers he'd met on the wall, Tyrion Lannister had liked Sir Alliser Thorne the least. A bitter, mean-spirited man with too great a sense of his own worth. Thorne was prickly as his name. I'm just, so it's funny, it's funny that Tyrion, like later they write that Tyrion doesn't like this guy, but he's literally spending every night dicing and drinking with them. But And maybe there's some other high officers that he likes spending time with, but it's funny that he just, I guess maybe he really likes Bowen Marsh. Maybe Tyrion got along with Bowen Marsh really freaking well, and so he liked drinking with him, because we already know that like he doesn't get along with Benjen, and now later we're told that he liked Sir Alliser the least. So who's he getting along with? Who are these high officers that Tyrion's just drinking and dicing with? Wants to spend his every evening with? Bowen Marsh? He really likes Bowen Marsh? Oh, I learn things everywhere I go. The little man gestured up the wall with a gnarled black walking stick. As I was saying, why is it that when one man builds a wall, the next man immediately needs to know what's on the other side? He cocked his head and looked at Jon with the curious, mismatching eyes. You do want to know what's on the other side, don't you? And this makes me think about the curtain with Bran. It's nothing special, Jon said. He wanted to ride with Benjen Stark on his rangings, deep into the mysteries of a haunted forest. Wanted to fight Mance Raider's wildlings and ward the realm against the others. See, the others are just well known here. But it was better not to speak of things you wanted. The rangers say it's just woods and mountains and frozen lakes, with lots of snow and ice, and Grumpkins and the Snarks. Tyrion said, "Let us not forget them, Lord Snow, or else, what's that big thing for? Don't call me Lord Snow." The dwarf lifted an eyebrow. "Would you rather be called the Imp? Let them see their words can cut you, and you'll never be free of the mockery. If they want to give you a name, take it, make it your own. Then they can't hurt you with it anymore." He gestured with his stick. This is, kind of a repeat of what Tyrion had already told him. That he already told that him to like armor himself with being a bastard. Now he's right. I'm trying to remember the first thing he said. He said, we're making the, he says, "Never forget what you are. For surely the world will not make it your strength. Then it can never be your weakness. Armor yourself in it, and it will never be used to hurt you. Let them see the words can't cut you, and then you'll never be free of. Let them see that their words can cut you and never be free of the mockery. If you want to give them a name, take it, make it your own. Then it can't hurt you. Then they can't hurt you with anymore." So at first he's saying, take their mockeries and make it an armor, so that it can't be used against you. And now he's saying that it's a sword, and you should take that sword from them. And so that now they can't use it. So this, I think, is in my opinion, it's George being a little, it's like I've complimented this chapter quite a bit, but this line is a little repetitious. He's compared insults to armor and then compared insults to swords with the same character giving the same advice, pretty much. Anyway, come walk with me. They'll be serving some vile stew in the common hall by now, and I could do with a bowl of something hot. Jon was hungry too. So he fell in beside Lannister and slowed his pace to match the dwarf's awkward waddling steps. The wind was rising, and they could hear the old wooden buildings creaking around them. And in the distance, a heavy shutter banging over and over, forgotten. Once there were muffling thumps of blankets of snow that slid from the roof and landed near them. Man, this is is this a really long chapter? Because I guess it's 5,169, but you can see this is so much just description of stuff. The story just keeps going on. "I don't see your wolf," Lannister said as they walked. "I chained him up in the old stables when we're training. They board all the horses in the east stables now, so no one bothers him. The rest of the time, he stays with me. My sleeping cell is in Harden's tower." It's amazing. Amazing that they allowed him to bring his wolf to the wall. Like, it's just, maybe just because it's Ned Stark's bastard, but it's just, Imagine trying to bring your dog into the army with you. And everybody would be like, what do you fucking... No, you can't bring your fucking dog. But this is a wolf. That like a huge freaking wolf that can maul people. I guess Benjen Stark's in the... You can't... My sleeping cell's in Harden's Tower. That's the one with the broken battlements, no? Shattered stone in the yard below. And a lean to it, like our noble King Robert after a long night's drinking. I thought all those buildings had been abandoned, Jon shrugged. No one cares where you sleep. Most of the old keeps are empty, so you can pick any cell you want. Once Castle Black had housed 5,000 fighting men with all of their horses and servants and weapons. Now it was home to a tenth that number, and part of it were falling into ruin. So this is I think here we learn that the Night's Watch is like 500 at Castle Black. But then they do the great ranging of like 200 from Castle Black who mostly get killed. You know, the numbers actually are somewhat work out in the end once you get to the election and stuff like that. George is fairly aware of it. Tyrion Lannister's laughter stemmed in the cold air. I'll be sure to tell your father to arrest some more stonemasons before your tower collapses. Also, the fact that it can house 5,000, and that's about Stannis' army when he comes. And how many people can fit? Stannis' army is I think it's a little less than that, right? 3,000. Jon could take the taste the mockery here, but there was no denying the truth, or maybe it was close to 5. I mean, Stannis ends up with about 5 when he gets to the Battle of Weiss, but that's adding on the hill clans and everything. The Watch had built 19 great strongholds along the wall, but only 3 were still occupied. East Watch on the gray windswept shore, the Shadow Tower hard by the mountains where the wall ended, and Castle Black between them at the end of the King's Road. Of course, the maps mention West Watch by the tower. So like I say, West Watch is never mentioned in the text, but it's on the maps that there's a West Watch by the tower. But here they're like, oh, this is where the wall goes from East Watch to the Shadow Tower, but then there's West Watch. But the other keeps long deserted were lonely, haunted place where the cold winds whistled through the black windows and the spirits of the dead man the parapets. Let me bring up. I mean, right? Is the West Watch? I've got to use the one from. The wall. I don't want any recreations. I want the one from the books. What is it? Going to be in Storm of Swords is the first time they use it. Yeah, that's right. West Watch by the bridge. I misspoke. West Watch by the bridge, not okay, so what they're saying is because West Watch is not part of the actual wall, that maybe he can say that this is true, that it's an extra tower across the river. 19 strongholds along the wall, but only 3 were still occupied. But it's not. The West Watch would not be along the wall; it would be separated. The Shadow Towers, hard by the mountains where the wall ended, and yeah, that just doesn't make any. That doesn't make sense. But it's fine, I guess. I mean, there's just. the Shadow Tower is supposed to hit mountains where the wall ends, but I think they changed this to like being the gorge and the Bridge of Skulls and a river. And but what the hell is Westwatch? Westwatch by the bridge. Anyway, it's better that I'm all by myself, Jon said stubbornly. The rest of them are scared of ghosts. Wise boys, Lannister said, then changed the subject. The talk is your uncle is too long away. Is too long away. Jon remembered the wish the wish he'd wished in his anger, the vision of Benjen Stark dead in the snow, and then looked away quickly. The dwarf had a way of sensing things, and Jon did not want him to see the guilt in his eyes. He said he'd be back on my name day, he admitted. His name day had come and gone, unremarked. A fortnight passed. So they were looking for Sir Waymar Royce, his father. By the way, Jon's age is really ambiguous because it's with regards to Robb's, because we never pinpoint exactly who's older, Robb or Jon, because of course, like it's kind of a giveaway if Jon is. Let's see. Jon is supposed to be younger because Ned fathers Robb right before he goes off to war. And then, so if Jon is somehow older, then, it goes to show that, he's not the father, unless you start believing like the fisherman's daughter story and all sorts of stuff. But it keeps it. In fact, I think there's a previous draft of Storm or something where Jon does say says he's older, and the line is removed in later drafts. So they're looking for Sir Waymar Royce. His father is bannerman to Lord Arryn. Uncle Benjen said they might search as far as the Shadow Tower. That's all the way up in the mountains. You'd think that Tyrion Lannister would know about the Royces, but it's exposition for us. I hear that a good many Rangers have vanished of late, Lannister said as they mounted the steps to the common hall. He grinned and pulled open the door. Perhaps the Grumpkins are hungry this year. Of course, this is, we're reading Game of Thrones for the first time. You really get this feeling that the danger of the others is like coming and pressing, and that because you've got this prologue and all of this talk, and then it's just not like it never happens. But we're getting this feeling, the people, the Rangers are disappearing. Well, you just assume that in connecting it to Waymar Royce. Inside the hall was immense and drafty, even with a fire roasting in the great hearth. Crows nested in the timbers of its lofty ceiling. Jon heard their cries overhead as he accepted a bowl of stew and a heel of black bread from the day's cooks. Man, just all this description. It's very, very later George, right? It's kind of rare to come across like this much in Game of Thrones. And we saw some in the cat chapter when she arrived at King's Landing, but it's such a stark difference from like those early chapters, which were so efficient. Gren and Toad and some of the others were seated at the bench nearest the warmth, laughing and cursing each other in rough voices. Jon eyed them thoughtfully for a moment. Then he chose a spot at the far end of the hall, well away from the other diners. Tyrion Lannister sat across from him, sniffing at the stew suspiciously. Barley, onion, carrot, he muttered. Someone should tell the cook that turnip isn't a meat. It's mutton stew. Jon pulled off his gloves and warmed his hands in the steam rising from the bowl. The smell made his mouth water. Snow. Snow! Jon knew Sir Alistair Thorne's voice, but there was a curious note in that he had not heard before. He turned. The Lord Commander wants to see you. Now. For a moment, Jon was too frightened to move. Why would the Lord Commander want to see him? They had heard something about they had heard something about Benjen, he thought wildly. He was dead. The vision had come true. Is it my uncle, he blurted? Is he returned safe? The Lord Commander is not accustomed to waiting, was Sir Alistair's reply. And I'm not accustomed to having my commands questioned by bastards. Tyrion Lannister swung off the bench and rose. Stop it, Thorne. You're frightening the boy. Keep out of the matters that don't concern you, Lannister. You have no place here. I have a place at court, though, the dwarf said, smiling. A word in the right ear, and you'll die a sour old man before you get another boy to train. Now tell Snow why the old bear needs to see him. Is there any news of his uncle? No, Sir Alistair said. This is another matter entirely. A bird arrived this morning from Winterfell with a message that concerns his brother. He corrected himself. His half-brother. Bran, Jon breathed, scrambling to his feet. Something's happened to Bran. Tyrion Lannister laid a hand on his arm. Jon, he said, I'm truly sorry. Immediate assumption that Bran is dead. Jon scarcely heard him. He brushed off Tyrion's hand and strode across the hall. He was running by the time he hit the doors. He raced to the commander's keep, dashing through drifts of old snow. When the guard passed him, he took the tower steps 2 at a time. By the time he burst into the presence of the Lord Commander, his boots were soaked and Jon was wild-eyed and panting. Bran, he said. What does it say about Bran? J.R. Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, was a gruff old man with an immense bald head and shaggy gray beard. We've got to get all these introductions of these characters in, right? He had a raven on his arm, and he was feeding it kernels of corn. I'm told you can read. He shook the raven off, and it flapped its wings, and it flew to the window, where it sat watching as Mormont drew a roll of paper from his belt and handed it to Jon. Corn? It muttered in a raucous voice. Corn, corn. Of course, we've just read the Bran chapter, so we're immediately connecting this raven to the three-eyed crow. It's you can't. I guess you cannot read the book and not immediately make that connection, right? Whether it's a true connection or not. Jon's finger traced the outline of the direwolf in the wax and broke the seal. He recognized Robb's hand, but the letter seemed to blur and run as he tried to read it. He realized he was crying. And then, through the tears, he found the sense in the words and raised his head. He woke up, he said. The gods gave him back. Maybe that's why Jon becomes religious. That he's convinced that the gods let Bran wake up. Crippled, Mormont said. I'm sorry, boy. Read the rest of the letter. Yeah, they already read the letter. Mormont did. He looked at the words, but they didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Bran was going to live. My brother is going to live, he told Mormont. The Lord Commander shook his head, gathered up a fistful of corn, and whistled. The raven flew to his shoulder, crying, Live, 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 live. Mormont's like, should have been mercy killed. The kid's crippled. He's like, I don't care if he's alive. It's a fate worse than death in Mormont's head. Jon ran down the stairs. A smile on his face and Robb's letter in his hand. My brother's going to live, he told the guards. They exchanged a look. He ran back to the common hall where he found Tyrion Lannister just finishing his meal. He grabbed the little man by the arms, hoisted him up in the air, and spun him around in a circle. Bran is going to live, he whooped. Lannister looked startled. Jon put him down and thrust the paper into his hand. Here, read it, he said. Others were gathering around and looked at him curiously. Jon noticed Gren a few feet away. A thick woolen bandage was wrapped around his one hand. He looked anxious and uncomfortable, not menacing at all. Jon went to him. Gren edged backwards and put up his hand. Stay away from me now, you bastard. Jon smiled at him. I'm sorry about your wrist. Robb used the same move on me once. I only with a wooden blade. It hurt like 7 hells, but yours must be worse. Look, if you want, I can show you how to defend that. Alistair Thorne overheard that. Lord Snow wants to take my place now, he sneered. I'd have an easier time teaching a wolf to juggle than you training with this Aurochs. I'll take that wager, Sir Alistair, Jon said. I'd love to see ghosts juggle. Jon heard Gren sucking his breath, shocked. Silence fell. Then Tyrion Lannister guffawed. 3 of the Black brothers joined in from a nearby table. The Lannister spread up and down the benches. The laughter spread up and down the benches until the cooks joined in. The bird stirred in the rafters, and finally, even Gren The birds stirred in the rafters, and even finally Gren began to chuckle. Sir Alistair never took his eyes from Jon. As the laughter rolled around him, his face darkened, and his sword hands curled into fists. That was a grievous error, Lord Snow, he said at last, in the acid tones of an enemy. Alistair Thorne does become Jon's enemy somewhat, but he's never like prime enemy, right? Like he's with Janis Slynt and stuff like this, but you can see that at the end of the story, Jon is taking the advice of Donal Noye. And the idea is that Donal Noye's way of seeing the world and Alistair Thorne's way of seeing the world, and Donal Noye's system and Alistair Thorne's system are going against each other here. That it's not about toughening people up and being mean, and that's not the way to get through life, because that makes you alone like Jon and hated, and it benefits nobody. But the way in the end is in getting through life is life's hard, but if you care about each other, sympathize, make friends, that's the way to get through things. And so, going back to the, so it's when you think about those movies like Officer and a Gentleman and Full Metal Jacket, that's Full Metal Jacket does not romanticize it, but certainly Officer and a Gentleman romanticizes that training, that going through something tough puts hair on your chest, and in the end you're a stronger person, and you're going to thank your teachers, and they actually care about you and all of this kind of stuff. And here, George is saying that no, some of those teachers are just fucking mean, and they're not training you, and the system is kind of flawed. And the way to really get through it is through empathy. Jon is offering caring, sympathetic instruction to Gren as a friend, rather than as a drill sergeant that's pushing it down into you to put hair on your chest, So it's and this whole idea gets expanded on later on, of course, with Sam. But So a great chapter. This is a really good chapter. I think George went there's a little heaviness on the descriptions of everything, and Tyrion's part is kind of shoved in there, but in the end, with regards to Jon's training, there's some really fantastic lines, and I don't think the Donal Noye life advice scene is some top-notch advice in writing there. So this is a overall winning chapter here, one of the better ones of A Game of Thrones, Jon III. Really quite important. Anyway, that's all for Jon III, and we will move on to what's next. Eddard, back to Eddard next time. Okay, thanks a bunch.